Amen. Well, we're working through a stewardship series, and I'm going to tell you right up front that I'm going to talk about money today. However, I really don't think that guilt is a great motivator, and so let's try to take that off the table from the very start. I'm not here to guilt you. I have no interest in guilting you. In fact, I don't think it's effective or helpful. My hope is that while we talk about money today, that we spend some time just thinking critically about our relationship to money, particularly as Americans. And in just a little bit, I'm going to go and read through a whole bunch of shocking statistics about Americans and money, happiness, income, all of these sort of things, just to think about what it is we're chasing after and what it actually does to us. And then we'll consider a story of Jesus's talking about money together as well. I brought my favorite picture of money ever. It's from a show called Breaking Bad. That's a comedian named Lavelle Crawford, and he is a narcoleptic bodyguard who falls asleep watching money. And it's probably not a very good thing to do if you're in charge of this much money, to fall asleep on it. However, I think whenever I see this picture, I think to myself, that is probably the American dream right there. To have so much money that we could take a nap on it. So I want this to sort of be an image in your mind as we talk about money and our relationship to it. Lavelle is famously overweight. He even had gastric bypass surgery and lost 200 pounds and is still overweight. He's a big boy, but to be fat and happy and sleepy and to have that much money, that seems as American as it gets. So let's keep that in mind as we talk about money. First, I want to talk about the Bible. Here are some random facts that are disputable because lots of people disagree, but this is generally the truth. Because, some people say, well, that verse is about money, that one's not about money, and people argue about anything, right? But roughly speaking, Jesus has 39 parables, and 11 of them are about money. There are 2,000 verses in the whole of the Bible that talk about money, as opposed to 500 that talk about prayer and faith. Think about how much we talk about the Christian faith as about having faith, asking Jesus into your heart. There are 500 verses about that, 4 times as many verses about how we have a relationship and spend and accumulate money. Now, the Bible also says, this is my favorite part. You want to know, what does the Bible say about money? Well, it says it's good, and it says it's bad. Lovely. It says it's dangerous, and it says it's helpful. It says that it is a tool, and it also says that it is a false god that people worship. So great, we should be able to cover all of that in about 15 to 30 minutes, right? Whew. Money is complex. I think we know this intuitively, but even the Bible agrees that money is complex. And so let's think a little bit about what it is we think money is as just a citizen, as just an American. Lots of people do lots of surveys to try to get to the bottom of what people think about money. And I've got a series about 4 or so slides here of different studies that have been done about money that I kind of hope will surprise you just a little bit. Let's check out the first one here. Americans had the largest quarter-over-quarter jump in credit card debt this last quarter, the most since it started being tracked in 1999. So Americans are going into personal debt more so than ever right now. We also have had the most serious credit card delinquencies since 2011, which is on the back end of the housing crash. Auto loan delinquencies have hit a 13-year high currently, And here's what, this is from the Fed, the Fed, right? You hear about them anytime you watch the news. And what confuses the Fed is that all of this debt is being accumulated by Americans while we have the strongest labor market and we have rising wages in decades. The unemployment rate is low and raises are rising across the board right now. And yet in spite of that, delinquencies and debt are climbing. It says a lot about how Americans like to spend their money, doesn't it? All right, check out the next slide. During COVID, workers were found to be 5 times more likely to worry about money than their health. Now you may think, oh, okay, that's interesting. Think about this. We had no idea what COVID was. People were dying in New York City. We had no idea what the long-term ramifications of this airborne virus was. No clue. And we were more worried about money than we were a possible killing disease. That's very American, isn't it? More than half of millennial millionaires, now think about that. Millennial means, like basically, you want to know what a millennial is? Anyone between mine and Austin's age. Okay, that's a millennial. Like millennials get made fun of by comedians as if they're like perpetually 22. No, millennials are basically Austin to me, okay? More than half of millennial millionaires are extremely or somewhat worried about losing their wealth. Now, we're not talking about someone who's making $22 an hour working in public works. We're talking about literal millionaires are extremely or somewhat worried about losing more than $1 million. A 2018 LinkedIn survey found that people's stress level fell after they started earning $50,000. Okay, that makes sense. But it started rising again after they started earning $200,000. Now think about that. You could see how the first time you get to a job that starts covering your bills, that your stress level would begin to drop. Okay. On the first of every month, I'm no longer worried about paying my rent or covering my credit card bills. You can imagine how stress levels would drop. So why in the world, when you quadruple that, do you start getting stressed again? It doesn't make any sense. Pastor Brian reminded me this week of a quote, one of my all-time favorite quotes, one of my favorite things anyone has ever said. In 1999, when I was a senior in high school, the National Basketball Association had a lockout, and Patrick Ewing, who was a basketball player I hated, I might add, he played for the Knicks. He was like the president of the players, and someone asked him about, turning down losing all of this money. And he says, well, you have to understand, we basketball players make a lot of money, but we spend a lot of money too. Now, that's kind of what I hear in this statistic, that the more we earn, we don't ever get to the point they're like, oh my goodness, now I can just start saving. We just start finding bigger and better toys to buy, and we keep spending and spending and even taking out debt no matter how much it is we earn. And so once we start getting into significant debts that we can cover, more and more can be lost and lost quickly, because this is how our relationship with money is. Let's check out the next slide. Over the last 25 years, there has been a decline in the following things as being seen as very important. This probably won't surprise you if you have, say, talked to one person. All these are in decline is very important. Patriotism, religion, hard work, parenting, and community involvement. All of those as being very important are in decline. This should not shock you at all. The only priority that has raised in the last 25 years is money. Now, I think this is really, really interesting. I think this is fascinating. I think this is worth thinking about longer than we'll have time for today. We are in a mental health crisis. Depression, anxiety is everywhere. People have lost meaning in their life. People are lonely. And at the same time, that things like community involvement, parenting, and hard work are erasing as valuable to us, and money is increasing. I bet there's a lot to unpack and to explore just right there. We have an expectation that money is going to do something for us and to us. And the truth of the matter is as soon as you start unpackaging that bow, there's something deeply unsatisfying underneath. Let's check out the next slide. These next two slides are maybe my two favorite stats. The median level of happiness on a 100-point scale, meaning if I asked you how happy you are on a scale of 1 to 100, the median response only varies 5 points from a family that earns $15,000 a year to a family that earns $200,000 a year. Now, I wouldn't have guessed that that was the case. I would have guessed a family that earns $15,000 a year. Now, here, $15,000 a year makes you homeless. You cannot rent an apartment on $15,000 a year, right? The median level of happiness is only 5 points difference between a family that earns $15,000 and a family that earns $200,000. Money does not make us happy. And check out this next stat from the same study. Quadrupling a person's income has an effect on well-being roughly equivalent to it being the weekend. Meaning, you know that feeling you get? Well, I should talk about my daughters for a second. I like seeing them on Friday. Friday at 3 o'clock is the happiest they are all week. It's great. It's great. They're chatty, they're smiley. Life is good at 3 o'clock on Friday. This is happy times, happy times. They don't have to go back to school for 2 whole days. It's basic. So we can admit, we can confess that we're happy for the weekend. That happiness you feel, which you also know is immediately followed by the existential dread of Saturday. I've only got one more of this. And then on Sunday, where you spend your whole day prepping for the next week, and all of a sudden it's gone, right? The same joy you have on Friday night that it's the weekend is all the bit of effect on well-being that quadrupling your income has. Now, I know what you're thinking right now. You're thinking, I'll be the guinea pig in that study. Let's go ahead and quadruple my income and see what happens. I think I'll be the one who's happier than it's just the weekend. But studying across the board over multiple people, quadrupling income, quadrupling, not doubling, not giving yourself a 5% raise, quadrupling income only makes you as happy or as well off as it being the weekend. That's a striking statistic. And yet, underneath all of this, we are chasing money. We're strategizing for money. We're trying to figure out how to save more, make more. Money is so central to the American experience. I spent some time this week with Philip Zimmerman, who was here just a few weeks ago from Germany. And he said something to me that shocked me, because I generally think, and I think this is generally true, that life in Germany isn't that different from life in America. If you were to go spend a month in Germany, you would not be uncomfortable at all. You would find people who speak to you in English. You would be just fine to spend a month in Germany all by yourself. Be a little different, not much different. He told me that he's shocked by Americans having credit card debt, that's not a problem in Germany. They don't have personal debt at all. No college loans, no credit card debt. This is just not something they do or think about. Debt is not a part of life in Germany. And I thought that sounded pretty crazy to me, because I'm so used to being American, and that functionally at the core of who we are is debtors. We don't love it when we have it, but we love taking debt because we love getting things. Debt is so important to the American experience. And yet, in one of the nearest nations to us culturally in the entire world, they more or less don't believe in debt. So today, talking about all of this, thinking about all of this American experience with money, I want to read a story to you from Jesus' gospel. And it's a story I imagine, if you've spent any time in church whatsoever, you've heard before. You might be familiar with it. You might even have an idea of what I might talk about from here, and we'll explore that in just one moment. The story is about a widow giving an offering at the temple. It's found in Luke chapter 21, and it's just 4 verses long. I'd like to invite you, if you would, to join me in standing as we read these 4 verses from the word of the Lord today. Luke 21, verses 1 to 4. As Jesus looked up, he saw the rich putting their gifts into the temple treasury. He also saw a poor widow put in 2 very small copper coins. "Truly I tell you," he said, "this poor widow has put in more than all of the others. All of these people gave their gifts out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in all she had to live on." This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You may be seated. All right, so I'm gonna have a risky experiment for just 1 second. All right? 4 verses. First of all, if you've heard this story before, would you raise your hand for me? You're familiar with this? Okay, look around. You see this? Most people have heard this story. So here's the experiment we're going to try. I'm going to give you 15 seconds to write the sermon I'm going to preach in your own head. Okay? Because we're so familiar, that means most of us have probably heard this sermon before. So I'm going to give you 15 seconds of silence, and I want you to write the sermon because my guess is you know what the outcome is, all right? Or 5 seconds in, you're probably already done, aren't you? All right, if you're willing to, turn to your neighbor and tell them what you think the sermon is going to be, all right? All right, now because I am a mentalist, I'm going to guess that the sermon goes something like this. Jesus saw rich people cutting a check that they could afford. He saw a woman who had nothing giving all that she had. Jesus praised the sacrificial giving. We should be sacrificial givers. Amen. Did I get that more or less correct? Yeah, okay. Wow, I'm really good at this. That's the basic way that this tends to be preached. And while I want to talk about this from another angle, like maybe if we just stepped about 15 feet to the side and looked at the same thing and thought about this again, we might be able to see it a little differently. But that doesn't mean that I think that sermon is wrong. This is not an undoing of everything you've ever heard. I just want to think about this from another way that could be interpreted. And in doing so, I want to talk just a little bit about how it is we read the Bible, because I think sometimes we could read the Bible a little better and see not something that's right versus wrong, but something that's fuller, if you will. So let's ask this question. We know how this has been preached. We know how this has been talked about. We have kind of an idea of where this might be going. I've read 4 verses to you. Now, let's ask, what happens if we read the context of the 3 verses right before? And the reason I say that is because the very first words that I read were, "as Jesus looked up," which immediately should have caused you to say, looked up from what? Like, Jesus wasn't dropped from a spaceship into Jerusalem at this moment for the story to start. There's some context in which this story is told. As Jesus looked up, and you should say, looked up from what? What is he doing? What caused him to look up and see? So the verses right before, 45 to 47, go like this. While all the people were listening, Jesus said to his disciples, "Beware of the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and love to be greeted with respect in the marketplaces. And they have the most important seats in the synagogues and the places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses." Well, that's heavy language. They devour widows' houses, and for a show, make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severe. They devour widows' houses. After Jesus says this, he looks up and he looks to where people give their gifts to the temple treasury. And what he sees is a bunch of rich people for show, wanting to be credited for how much they've given to the temple that day. And while all of the attention of the treasury is on rich people throwing money around, he sees an anonymous woman whose name we're not given, coming with 2 copper coins and dropping it into the temple treasury. And Jesus says about this widow, she has given all that she has. Now, there's a way to say what faithful giving, but there's also a way to say in context here, it's that the rich, holy people of Israel are making it so widows give the last of their money to support the ministry of the temple. Jesus is already hammering how the teachers of the law in this day are devouring widows' homes. Maybe Jesus isn't congratulating the woman near as much as saying, we've created a system that is devouring this widow's home. Maybe he isn't celebrating her near as much as saying she should be able to keep her 2 coins in this system like this. We shouldn't have religious systems that are built on the back of poor widows getting poorer. Maybe Jesus is being as critical as the system as he is affirming of the widow. Maybe you're not convinced yet. Let's carry on, if we can, to the next 2 verses after this. Because the disciples hear this story, but they really don't respond to it. You know, there are times in the Gospels where the disciples pull Jesus aside and say, yo, man, what are you talking about? Like, you said this to all these hundred of people who are here, but that doesn't make any sense at all. Can you explain it to us because we're your buddies? They don't ask for any explanation of this, so we're left to make some decisions on our own as interpreters of the text. Because the disciples don't help us out at all by asking Jesus to explain himself. So the disciples seem kind of unbothered by this story, in fact, and they transition to the next thing on their mind. This is what happens in verse 5. Some of his disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Jesus said, as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. So, you have rich people coming into the temple. They're making it rain all over the place just so that people will praise them. Look how generous all of these rich people are. Look how much money they're giving to the temple. Jesus says, I think, sure, great. All the attention's on them, but look at the widow who has nothing to give and is giving it all. And the disciples are essentially saying next, wow, look how beautiful and wonderful all of this is. This is gorgeous. This is amazing. Have you ever seen anything like this back in Nazareth, back in Galilee where we're from? This must be the most beautiful building in the entire world. Jesus, isn't it awesome? It's dedicated to your Father. It's a gift given to him. Think about how glorious and wonderful our God must be if he's got a building like this. And Jesus is unimpressed. He's like, hey, give it a couple years, this thing is coming down. All of this show, all of this gift, all of this money, all of this cutting checks by rich people just to be patted on the back by other rich people. And Jesus is essentially saying it's all a waste. It's all going to come down. And if you know your Jewish or Roman history, it is not 3 or 4 decades later before Rome comes in and tumbles this entire building. Jesus' predictions of the temple coming down are right. Some of the people in that hallway that day watching this whole thing will be alive when the temple is sacked and ruined by Rome. So there's this entire financial system that's built up to maintain this building that is supposed to bring glory to God. And everyone who has is giving just enough to impress the right people. but not one of them who are cutting big checks to make sure that the stones are gorgeous on the outside of the temple, notice that in their very vicinity, in their very network of people, within where their eyes can see, that there is a widow who would have her life changed if they just grabbed 2 copper coins out of their pocket and gave it to her under the table so that she could pay with someone else's money and go home with something to make sure that she still might be able to eat tomorrow. The rich, the wealthy, are concerned about being rich and wealthy even at the time of worship. But their concern about appearances doesn't allow them to see the appearance of the needy people in their very midst. Which begs the question, what are they giving to? Who are they giving to? Why are they giving? Because a truly transformed heart probably isn't giving for the accolades. A truly transformed heart probably slips in and out and probably notices that someone is going to go hungry by giving less than nothing in their own pocketbook. What would this story have looked like if Jesus had looked up and seen not this widow giving everything, but instead someone helping her out to make sure that she could go home with something? Let's walk through the context of this text again, just to be clear. The teachers of the law devour widows' houses. Rich people are showing off their gifts. A widow is dropping the last of her money she has into the temple treasury, and Jesus ends up claiming that the temple will be destroyed. So, what if a better reading of this text is not to praise the widow, but instead to question everything around her? Now, that's not to not praise the widow. She could have not shown up. She could have tried to fly under the radar and not get caught. She did something remarkable here. But what if there's a better story to be told, and that's what Jesus is trying to point us to? Perhaps, just maybe, the rich could have been worried about the poverty around them rather than seeming wealthy. Perhaps the temple should not be maintained on the back of poor widows. Perhaps the teachers of the law should be more concerned by the poor than hanging around rich braggarts. Maybe, just maybe, this would be an entirely different world if people weren't wanting to seem and to hang out with rich people, but instead were asking questions about what might God have us do in light of the world we live in. What might it look like if I came to the temple not to be seen with wealthy people and not to be seen as wealthy, but instead to say, what is God doing? Where is God moving? And how can I be there? I think at the heart of this text, no matter how you look at it, the question at play is about generosity. But it's not just simply, I hope you see, about the widow being generous. Not just about that. But those who are blessed with resources not being generous enough so that the widow, she needs to face hunger in light of the fact that she had to give this amount of money as her portion to maintaining the temple. So the challenge of this text, as I think I read it, as I think I see it here, is to ask ourselves, who are we meant to be when we have enough? Because we live in a world filled with women who have nothing but 2 copper coins. And many of us in this room have more than that. Who are we meant to be if honestly we look more like the teachers in the law in the rich than the widow? Why should we spend time celebrating the widow when that's not really how most of our economics look like in America? Shouldn't we instead put ourselves in the shoes of those that Jesus are criticizing in this text and wonder, do I match the people that Jesus is being critical of far more than the person that Jesus is affirming? There's a Chinese philosopher named Lao Tzu in the 6th century BC who wrote a proverb that I think is beautiful and helpful for us as we walk away from this text. He said, "He who knows he has enough is rich." I'm not sure that this proverb quite matches the American definition of rich, because we are so conditioned, just culturally, uncritically, and I want to make sure that you understand that while I'm about 4 steps above you in preaching, I belong sitting next to you with the next things that I'm going to say, because I'm equally convicted and deserve equal conviction to think and spend time about this. We have been conditioned from the time we are very little to have no definition of enough, to pursue more all of the time, which is why in America, as our income increases, so does our concern that we're going to lose it all. In theory, as our income increases, there should be a gap between what we have and what we make that allows us to save, that we no longer need to be concerned. But we're not good with enough. So the more we have, the more we want. The more we want, our definition of rich changes to the point that we can rarely ever get to the point in American culture that any of us could define ourselves as rich. Because there's always more to acquire. There's always more to chase after. There's always more to earn. And with each thing we check off the list, we find happiness doesn't follow behind. I started out by pointing out you could quadruple your income, and the joy is about equivalent to it being Friday night. He who knows he has enough is rich. So, what would our spending look like if we confessed before God that we had enough? What would change in our life with a healthier, more robust definition of enough? This series is called Entrusted, and we're doing that not because at any point do I want you to feel guilty about the number that you report to the IRS in a couple months. That's not the point here at all, not even close to the point. But what I want us to think about is, what if the number that we report to the IRS here in a couple months is resource that God has entrusted us with? What if it's not something that I've accomplished or earned? What if it's not about my skills? What if it's not about how awesome I am? What if it's not about how good I can look when I walk around in public? What if it's about what God has entrusted me with? And what if I look at that number as not so much earn all I can so I can be as awesome as I can, but what if I looked at the resources that God has given me and say, this is what I've been given to steward. I am a part of God's mission in this world, and this is a part of what God has given me. What would change if I saw myself not as someone who's accomplished something, but someone who has been given a gift by God? And the call on my life is to steward it for the sake of God's call on my life. And so the last question I want to leave you with today before we sing our final song has to do with the mission and vision of the church, where we long at Crossroads to bring heaven on earth. We want to see heaven break into people's lives, because that's how Jesus taught us to pray in the Lord's Prayer. So, what if our money was a part of what God has entrusted us with in order to bring heaven on earth? What if it's something we'll be held accountable before God one day? What if it's something that we can make a transformative difference in people's lives? What if Jesus were outside of our worship gatherings and looked up and didn't see widows breaking their back in their home in order to give, but instead saw a joyously giving people. A people who saw that God had given them so much, and with joy instead were leveraging what God had given them for the sake of seeing heaven break into earth in our church, in our community, in our homes, our schools, all over. What if what we had been given was something we'd been entrusted with, and we had responsibility back to God with it? How would that change our spending patterns, our definitions of enough? And how would we be different then than the rich people who are high-fiving each other in the background when the temple is being built on the backs of widows who are broken? We're going to sing a final song that's called the Hymn of Heaven. It's about seeing the glory of God. And I just want you to spend some time thinking about what heaven will look like, and wondering, in light of the heaven that I anticipate and long for, what would it look like for me to participate in that with the way I earn and the way I spend as well? Would you stand with me as we close today?